I'm just going to introduce our first presenter, which is Professor John Garry. John is a Professor of Political Behaviour and lead in the Democracy Unit in Queen's University in Belfast. And he's also, which I'm very pleased, a member of our advisory support group. John is an expert in the whole issue of deliberative democracy, which is what this process is about, and he'll certainly bring us through some of the workings of the process and things we need to guard against, etc., and how the process should work effectively. So very pleased to welcome John to present you all today. Thank you. And sorry, I will say at the start of all presenters, we will really be keeping it to time because we've quite a lot to, so I might sound a bit harsh at times, so we really need to keep it to time, including myself and Cathal. So over to you, John. Well, thank you.
Don't worry, you won't have to call security to drag me off the stage. I won't take that long. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today to offer a brief overview of citizens' assemblies. Just to introduce myself a little bit to add to what has just been said. So I'm from Queen's University in Belfast, where I'm a Professor of Political Behaviour and Director of the Democracy Unit Research Centre. And as Paul has said, I'm on this advisory support group to this Citizens' Assembly on drugs use. And in terms of my role on it, well, for every Citizens' Assembly that's been set up in Ireland over the years, there's been someone from a politics or a political science background who observes and advises on deliberative democracy principles and practice, and works with the Secretariat and the Assembly Chair to help design a process that adheres to best practice. So today what I want to do is say a few words about what citizens' assemblies are in very general terms. And when we're describing what citizens' assemblies are, I think it's helpful to start with three really simple questions. Well, who takes part? What do they actually do? And what's the actual outcome? And in relation to the first question, who takes part? Well, citizens' assemblies are often around the world made up of around 100 members of the general public, such as yourselves. And these 100 people are usually randomly selected, which is a bit similar to the way that members of a legal jury are selected. And there's a check to make sure that these 100 people are a good representation of the country as a whole, with an accurate balance in terms of gender, in terms of what part of the country you're from, and how young or old you are. So the 100 members are essentially a small version of the whole adult population of the country. And that's why sometimes citizens' assemblies are often described as mini-publics. That's a term that's used about them sometimes around the world. And that's because the 100 people in the citizens' assembly are a miniature version, a mini version of the general public as a whole. Simply another way to say this is the 100 people are a good representation of the country. The second question, well, what do the citizens actually do? Well, the main job of the members of a citizens' assembly is simply to learn and discuss, to learn about the issue that the citizens' assembly is on and to discuss aspects of that issue with each other. And on foot of that, to carefully consider different possibilities for changing the way the world is at the minute. And there's a very fancy word to use this, the word deliberate often comes up in these discussions, and that's simply a word which is used. If you deliberate, all that means is that you're learning and you're discussing and you're considering something in detail, and you're weighing up the pros and the cons of different approaches to that issue, and you're weighing up the pros and cons of different ways of possibly changing and having different policy changes to that issue. And when we think of these two terms that I've mentioned here, mini-public and deliberate, from these terms, we can see that citizens' assemblies around the world are often described as deliberative mini-publics. Basically, miniature versions of the general public who consider an issue. So it's a useful term, as well as citizens' assemblies, to keep in mind, a deliberative mini-public. And onto the third issue, well, what is the outcome? Well, the whole point of a citizens' assembly isn't just to bring you to a nice hotel and have nice dinners. The whole point is to make some possibly recommendations for changing the situation as it currently is. So after you've done all the deliberating, learning, discussing, considering the issue in details, you'll have to vote. You have to make a decision at the end. You'll have to vote on something. And the members you could choose to just leave everything the way it is. After thinking it through, you think, well, can't really improve things because all the other options aren't very good. Or you can recommend a change and choose between different ways of making changes, different options for changing the world. And as has been mentioned, the recommendations that are made then by citizens' assemblies generally, they feed back into the political system for consideration by the government and the Parliament. So as well as answering these three simple questions, it's useful to just reflect that citizens' assemblies are used increasingly all around the world. They're sometimes used on issues which some people regard as quite boring, such as changing the electoral system, as has been done in British Columbia, in Canada, or great big issues such as climate change, as has been done in the Climate Citizens' Assembly in the UK, or quite famously in Ireland on quite sensitive and divisive social issues, such as the issue of abortion in the 2016-2018 Irish Citizens' Assembly. And in fact, Ireland has become quite well known internationally as the country that has actually used citizens' assemblies quite a lot on important issues and has produced significant or real change as a result of these citizens' assemblies. And the recommendations from some previous citizens' assemblies, as has been mentioned, have led to referendums to change the Constitution, which then allow changes in the law to come in. So on same-sex marriage, for example, or on abortion provision, and referendums are planned on the constitutional reference to women's life within the home or voting rights on presidential elections. But it doesn't have to be changes to the Constitution which come out of citizens' assemblies. As has been mentioned on this Citizens' Assembly on drug use, the potential recommendations that you may make could relate to changing the law or suggesting new legislation. Or it could be simply changing policy or policy guidelines, or it could relate to the details of how laws and policies are actually implemented. That's where the change, recommended change, could possibly be. And as well as answering the simple three questions and describing, technical assistance, as well as it's not Russian hackers. I may have just lent on the wrong thing.
What slide were you on? Go forward there, please.
This is the tricky bit. I have to remember what I was actually saying so I can go back to the...
It's freezing again. 2 seconds.
Okay. Well, I'll keep talking while he's fiddling with the computer in case you get bored. As well as answering questions about how they're structured and what recommendations we could make, an important question to reflect on is why we have citizens' assemblies in the first place. Are they actually a good idea or not a good idea? And there's a kind of simple way to answer this question, because if you imagine somebody who's puzzled about an important, sensitive political issue, and they're listening to TV debates or politicians, and then they just have a thought. They think, I wonder what a selection of the general public would come up with if they had the chance to really learn about this issue and carefully consider all the options. And this is a really simple question that might pop into people's minds when they're thinking about how democracy works. And citizens' assemblies are kind of an answer to this particular question. Citizens' assemblies allow people, ordinary general members of the public, to kind of calmly and politely, and perhaps somewhat boringly, consider politics and political debate. And certain actors are kept out. So political parties aren't sitting amongst you. Members of the media aren't sitting around your tables. It's simply members of the general public who come in to learn about things, deliberate in terms of considering them and talking to each other about them, and then making recommendations. So in a way, citizens' assemblies are a kind of a response to some people thinking that democracy maybe doesn't work perfectly the way it is. In other words, maybe the acrimonious debate between political parties or on the TV and on the radio just turns people off. And citizens' assemblies are a space for the general public to come in and think things through. Now, they shouldn't be seen as some kind of magical answer to all of democracy's problems, because in the debates amongst researchers and academics, there are skeptics about citizen assemblies as well as supporters. The supporters are usually called deliberative Democrats because they like the idea of citizens deliberating with each other and then that feeding back into the democratic process. So they think that's a way to get a deliberative democracy. Thanks for the opportunity to provide this very simple overview sketch, and good luck with all your deliberation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, and despite the technical interruptions, you really kept the time, so we appreciate that. I guess 2 or 3 takeaways from me, just in John's presentation, opening piece. Firstly, very welcome, because it did give us a wider context about what a citizens' assembly is about. But I particularly picked up the piece around learning, discussing and deliberating. And it's something that we have time for, and the process gives us that time to do that. Secondly, looking at the possibilities for change. Like I said in my own opening remarks, you may change your view as you move along. You might feel there's a possibility for change today, and then you feel it's something different as we move. So that's important. And equally, the point made at the very opening part of John's presentation, you do mirror the public, and you're a kind of a minor public in itself. So you mirror the reflection of the population in general. So I think that's very well represented. So thanks, John. I know John is going to work very closely with us over the next few months to help us steer the assembly process, to help us make sure that we're sticking to the good principles of a citizens' assembly. So we thank John for his expertise presentation today, but really glad to have him on board.